Hello, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to McDuff Lives. And thank you very much, Harley Schlanger, for making time for us once again for a kind of a free range and lively interview. It's always fun for me, and I think our guests and our subscribers enjoy it very, very much. It's one of our most popular shows. So, once again, welcome, Harley Schlanger.
Well, thank you very much, John. I always look forward to it, and having it every other week means that there are a whole pileup of events that have occurred since the last time we talked, so it's never boring.
No, and with that in mind, I'm going to let you go first. What do you want to start with?
Well, there seems to be a dawning recognition among at least certain people that the policies of the so-called unipolar order, the rules-based order, are not popular with the rest of the world. Two examples. One is Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, who was interviewed on one of the Sunday blab shows, and she just said sanctions are endangering dollar hegemony. And she explained it properly, that countries that fear they might be sanctioned, that the US might take their money, feel less likely to work with the United States and to cooperate with us. And she said this is a problem. Although she didn't say we're going to stop the sanctions, she said the sanctions are necessary. This is part of the price we pay. This is part of the risk we take by standing for democracy. So she got it half right. The policies are alienating most of the world, but they're not because the United States is standing for good, but because the US is imposing policies that are for the benefit of private special interests and not for sovereign nations. Now, even more interesting is the person who is sometimes described as either a cross between Asperger's syndrome and a genius, Larry Summers. I think the genius comes from his self-description. But the former Treasury Secretary and all-around economic whiz kid, Summers said U.S. policy is making the United States very lonely. And he talked about the move away from the dollar, D-dollarization. And he said the United States is on the right side of history, just as Yellen did, but it's not going to be easy. Now, in this context, we have a further warning from someone who's an insider in France who knows a lot about strategic policy. I don't think he's necessarily all that trustworthy, but Jacques Attali, a former top advisor to Jacques Chirac, he goes back to the end of the Gaullist period, one of the French gold bugs. But what he said is that this summer, he's expecting a serious global financial crisis because of the total debt in the dollar system. And he didn't break it down too much other than to say government debt, private sector debt in the United States is at record levels. One thing he did point to is the record trade deficit the United States has. And he also pointed out that this is not because the United States is such a vibrant economy and is buying so much from the rest of the world. He said it's because the United States isn't producing what it needs and has to pay to the rest of the world to produce for it. And the US services that were once so attractive to the rest of the world, including financial services, real estate, things of that sort, are losing their luster. And so here you have warnings from three people who know a little bit, but at least the first two, Summers and Yellen, are a spokesman for the system. And then you have, in the midst of this, a foreign ministers meeting going on in Japan. And before the meeting, Anthony Blinken stuck all 3 feet in his mouth, talking about how the rest of the world has to be wary of China. China's aggressive. China isn't trying to help anybody but itself. And what he was reacting to was what happened at the International Monetary Fund meeting in Washington, the annual spring meeting, where the IMF was forced to report that the one country that is experiencing solid, sustainable economic growth is China, while the West is sputtering. And the IMF pointed to the same thing that Summers and Attali were talking about, US debt. And what the IMF said is that the debt situation is out of control. Now, the IMF was forced to report that it is going to have to adopt tough measures to collect the debt. Now, that's going to drive more countries away from the dollar system, because in order to get dollar credit, through the SWIFT system, investment, finance, trade, they're going to have to do what the IMF tells them, which is to cut their spending. But they can't do it because their prices are higher because of inflation, their supply chain shortages, all kinds of problems, and they're looking for a way out. Well, what's the way out? The Chinese at the IMF meeting went ahead and forgave large amounts of developing sector debt. They reduced the interest on some of the debt. They canceled some of the debt. They extended the terms on some of the debt. And one leader from Africa after another was asked, well, why are you turning to China? And they say, well, China comes in and they help us build railroads. They help us build roads, hospitals, power plants. The United States comes in and sends in military aid and lectures us about democracy. So this is why the world is shifting in a dramatic way. It makes it more dangerous because if you think that Blinken and Biden and the people who pull their strings are going to accept the decline of the US empire peacefully, well, I think if you look at an example Helga has been using, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Gorbachev was very willing to cut back the so-called Soviet empire. They didn't try to confront the West. They didn't insist on keeping the Warsaw Pact together. They dismantled it. They got rid of a lot of the weapons that were in Eastern Europe, and they did it peacefully. I don't think the Western Empire has that kind of magnanimity in its blood. So we could be heading for a financial crisis. And one final point, just to throw this out, the Pentagon reports that were released on Ukraine, I don't know why anyone's surprised by them. Anyone who watches serious military analysts like Douglas McGregor or Scott Ritter knows that Ukraine can't win. The fact that some in the US military are acknowledging that in private communications, that shouldn't be a big surprise. But what we're seeing is the likely fizzle of the so-called Ukraine counteroffensive. And then will we have a blame game? Will we have an acknowledgement that Ukraine can't win, that the West was wrong, or will they escalate? The Guardian today wrote that the British delegation at the Japan foreign ministers meeting of the G7 is going there saying that now we have to double down on the weapons and the support for Ukraine because the whole situation is in flux. And if we don't, words are not enough, we have to deliver. And there are reports that there are British special forces inside Ukraine, as well as US special forces. And Seymour Hersh this week revealed that there are brigades of the 81st Airborne, and I think it's the 101st Airborne, stationed in Poland and Romania, which means you'll have almost 20,000 US troops and logistical support on the borders of Ukraine and Poland and Romania. Will they be sent in if the Ukrainian army cracks? Well, it all makes for a very dangerous mix.
Sure does. Well, where shall I? Let's start with Ukraine. You know, I watched a number of the battlefield reports, you know, with the various regiments moving around and the front lines moving and things like that. And it's clear that Russia's been on the brink of some big breakthroughs for quite some time. And at the same time, the Ukrainians have been able to withhold them for quite some time. And now they have this supposedly an army of like 80,000 troops that are ready to make a spring counteroffensive. However, it looks like, as you just said, that it's not happening. And if that doesn't happen, then what's going to happen is the Russians are going to have to just really put on a huge offensive to grab the necessary parts of the Donbass that they claim as part of Russia now, before what Blinken and Nuland want, and that is to be really confronting a doubled or tripled in size Ukrainian army supplied by NATO, and of course with those advisors at their shoulders telling them what to do. That that um, that could happen. It could happen a year from now. It could happen this fall. But right now, if Russia does want to nip this thing in the bud, they're going to have to go on a huge offensive, and it's just going to be horrible. And I don't see anybody talking peace anymore. It's just like they're going to have to go at it, and it's very
Well, your assessment is in general correct, although I think Ukraine will launch some kind of an offensive. I think Russia will probably launch a further offensive. But I think for the moment, the battlefield is in the Russians' favor because they do have the Ukrainians bottled up in a couple of cases. And it's not clear that the weapons from NATO will be enough to be a game changer. But on the question of peace, there have been a number of very interesting moves recently. One was President Lula from Brazil went to China. And Lula has called for a peace conference. He called for a club of peace. And he's talking to Indonesia, India, China, and a number of other countries that are open to this. And what they're saying is there should be a ceasefire. Now, at the same time, you have the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates starting to weigh in on the side of China and others. So there's a significant shift underway. Then you had Macron's trip. Now, this, of course, is very interesting because if you know anything about Macron, he can be a chameleon of the best sort. That is, he'll change his colors in a second. But Macron at the same time was saying, yes, we'll provide the support, but no, we shouldn't encourage the war to continue. Macron is under enormous pressure. And he did get the court to uphold his diktat, which is that you don't need the National Assembly to make policy. Now, isn't it ironic, John, that right after we've had this second summit for democracy with the extolling of how wonderful democracy is in the West, you have Macron overruling the National Assembly, not even letting them vote, and imposing his pension reform when there are a million or more Frenchmen in the streets. And that's just one example. In Greece, the government is continuing with European Union austerity. When you have railway strikes, you had this terrible, fatal train crash about 2 weeks ago because of the budget cuts, and Greek unions and everyone else are in the street. The Italian situation is somewhat paralyzed over wages. You have this encroaching sense of doom in Europe. And Macron comes back and says, we should not decouple with China. That would be a big mistake. And immediately he's under attack. And who attacks him? The US State Department. And of all people, I really appreciated what former Congressman Ron Paul said, who was a candidate for president a couple of times. Ron Paul said, it looks like peace is breaking out in the Middle East, and the United States is opposed to it. Well, that's how it looks to the rest of the world. I don't know if the Americans see that yet because our media is so corrupt and so unable to put together a coherent picture. We get a bit here, a bit there sometimes, but mostly we get the talking points of the war party and the talking points of the bankers. And so people aren't aware of how fragile the situation is internationally. But I think that the other thing you're hearing is that Putin's army is in trouble, Putin's in trouble, and he's likely to escalate to nuclear weapons if the Ukrainians make a breakthrough. I think there was an interesting signal that came from Moscow last week from Prigozhin, who's the head of the Wagner Group or the Wagner Group, which has been doing a lot of the fighting, a lot of the big damage to the Ukrainian army. And he said, look, we've accomplished most of our objectives. Maybe now is the time to go ahead for a peaceful settlement. Now, I don't know if he's speaking for Putin, if that's just throwing something out there. Putin was meeting with his defense staff in the last couple of days. There's a lot going on the Ukraine front. But the idea that somehow the Ukrainians are going to muster a large enough army to remove the Russians from the Donbass, that's what these Pentagon papers that were just released show, that US officials are saying it's not going to happen. And of course, General Milley told us that 6 months ago. So unless these guys are drinking something or popping certain kinds of pills that are giving them delusions, most of this is hot air. Now, I should have mentioned this earlier, John, but one of the things that was most amusing in a way is this whole story of the release of these papers. There's not much in the papers that are really revelations. The fact that there's a fight going on in military and intelligence against the State Department and the National Security Council assessments, that's been out there for a while. The fact that the US continues to spy on everybody, including Zelensky, including the South Koreans and the Japanese, that's not exactly a big surprise to anyone who watched what Snowden revealed. What I found most fascinating is the story became finding the leaker. Let's find the leaker, and how the New York Times and the Washington Post helped the FBI find the alleged leaker. Not, is there going to be any accountability for what the leaks showed? You know, this is the same model as the attack on Snowden. The outrage was that Snowden released the documents, not what the documents showed. The same thing of the Assange leaks on Afghanistan, that the idea was, let's jail Assange, call him a traitor, put him in a dungeon in a dark hole somewhere, not raise the questions of who is violating international law repeatedly with torture, with killing of civilians. There's no accountability for the United States in the world. And this plays into what's becoming a rapid rush for an off-ramp from Ukraine and a move away from the dollar. So I think all these things fit together in a very compelling picture.
Wow. Well, you just added the dollar issue, but I wanted to go back to the issue of what's going on behind these new Pentagon papers.
Yeah.
The fact that they were released by an airman of just very enlisted man rank is
In
very
the National Guard, not even in the real army.
okay. A National Guardsman.
Air National Guard.
Well, it reminds me of the story of the Moorer Radford affair, in which Admiral Thomas Moorer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had a corpsman, a Navy corpsman named Radford, spying on the White House and grabbing materials and bringing it back to the Pentagon so that Moorer could see what Nixon and Kissinger were really up to.
Yeah.
That story has been reprinted recently, and I love to read that because it has this tinge of, wow, you're getting an inside look at some big battle between what the Pentagon wants and what the White House wants, and what So does that resonate with what's going on here? That somebody in some high position in the Pentagon would have enabled this leak, and thereby allowing a debate to happen in the public that wouldn't have happened otherwise, without having the questions raised that are raised by this document. And then secondarily, the question is, can we rely on it, or is it disinformation?
Well, there are stories out there, people questioning and saying that this may be disinformation. Initially, they were saying maybe this is helping the Russians, and the Russians did it, the usual thing. But I refer to Ray McGovern, who had 27 years as a CIA analyst, including for a period of about 3 years, he was one of the principal briefers of President Reagan. So he knows a lot about this. And he said it's inconceivable to him that a 21-year-old with no serious intelligence clearance could get these documents unless they were somehow handed to him, which would tend to play into what you're talking about with the Radford case. On the other hand, you're getting these reports saying, well, the post 9/11 situation, they said we need more eyes on the ball, more people looking at these things. But would that really include a National Guard's airmen with no intelligence credentials? So it is somewhat plays into this idea that somebody is trying to make sure that these debates get out into the open. And again, General Milley tried to do this. He did, and again, I don't trust Milley, but he was saying 6 months ago that Ukraine isn't going to win. The fact that they had a relatively successful offensive, let's stop here, let's negotiate, and that was slapped down. The fact that the Pentagon immediately went into high-level damage control mode to try and change the subject with the media support, change the subject from what's the content in the papers to who leaked it and who caught them. And isn't it great that the Washington Post and the New York Times were smart enough to figure out how to go into this gaming site and figure it out? So there's a lot to this story that doesn't pass the smell test. But I think the important thing is that it does show that there's not unanimity behind the idea that if we just pour more weapons in and stick with the Ukrainians, that we'll win this fight. And very important then was the second or third bombshell from Seymour Hersh, which came out last week, where he reported on CIA Director Burns taking a trip to Kiev to communicate to Zelensky that the US is not pleased with the fact that $400 million was skimmed off the top by Zelensky and his associates from the US aid. That secondly, that there were 38 or 35 people in his immediate circle in defense and security who were skimming money, and that he has to do something about it. So Zelensky, according to Hersh, fired 10 of the 35 people, but most of the rest of them were reassigned or remained on the job. And then what Hersh hinted at is that there's a great deal more to this question of corruption. And he brought up that a gallon of diesel fuel in Afghanistan, to deliver it to the troops in Afghanistan, cost $400 per gallon because it had to be airlifted or shipped in special containers. And that he's saying that, do the math. $100 billion, where's it going? How much of it is actually reaching the battlefield? And what do we really know about Zelensky's inner circle? So, and Hersh said there were several sources for this story. So, we still never got the answer from Biden as to whether or not he's going to confess to blowing up the pipeline. I think it might be interesting for Biden to say, yeah, okay, we did it. See, you can't say I'm incompetent. We did what we said we were going to do. But of course, if he did that, it would blow the deal he has with Olaf Scholz of Germany and so on. So there are all these questions, John, and this is, this is the way intelligence works. You have different cover stories out there, but somewhere in there, there's a kernel of truth. And the truth is that this war was a disaster to start with. It could have been avoided. It was not inevitable. It was not unprovoked. The U.S. did know that they were treading on very thin ice by talking about Ukraine's accession into NATO. And so, at some point, if we make it through this period, there's going to be a rich history, and a future John O'Loughlin is going to sort through this on a podcast and be somewhat amazed at how all of this should have been seen at the time, but was missed.
Well, yeah, I would love to have the crystal ball and say, okay, we're just going to kick back and let this unwind because obviously it's going to come out okay. I think, the NATO attitude reminds me a lot of the triumph of the will. The idea, and of course, you have many examples in American, like Gordon Liddy, who wrote an autobiography called Will. And I think, if you study, well, it's, of course you do, but as I've been studying the Nazis and their philosophy at all, a lot of it is about just belief, and the belief that they are on the right side of history, that this is their struggle. And that Nazi attitude may very well be existing in a lot of the people that support the Zelensky regime. And of course, not just the Azov and the Bandera people, but also the people, the philosophy that would sit behind those armies and to finance them and to allow them to commit the atrocities and to do the ethnic cleansing and all of that. So that this idea, it also goes along with some reading I've been doing on the subject of what did the Nazis think of democracy, and what I understand is that they thought they were being they thought that Nazi National Socialism was democracy, in that the working people are the people that are the ultimate power in the country, and it is them working their labor unions, their syndicalism, and their working together through the businesses to control the national policy, which happens to be, the policy of the National Socialists. That idea in their minds that we are being democratic, this is democracy. That's what I think Victoria Nuland is thinking. When Tony Blinken says we are on the side of democracy, it's not democracy as Americans think of it. It's a whole different idea, and it has to do with a totalitarian idea of the folk or the people, and that the people have to be guided by a wise leader, and that whole nonsense from ancient history. So that's
I don't think they could be that deluded, because if you actually do look at the inner circle of the Nazis, one of the first things they did in the first year in power, shortly after the emergency decree, was they had a May Day, the traditional May Day demonstration of labor. They called all the labor leaders into Berlin for a march, and then the next day they arrested them all and created the Nazi Labor Front. And they made sure that there would be no unrest coming from the unions. They did a similar thing to the opponents, the political opponents, including killing von Schleicher, the former chancellor. So the idea of democracy in the case of someone like Blinken, I don't know if he can be so deluded as to say with a straight face that he's standing for the right in history. When he made this comment, I don't know if you saw this, but he was asked about what he would say to the children who were suffering because of sanctions in countries like Syria. And he said, well, every night I look into the eyes of my children and see the Syrian children and see how they're suffering under Assad. And that's why we have to have the sanctions. Well, the sanctions that are imposed on Syria are killing people. Assad is not killing his people. The idea that somehow, as Madeleine Albright said, it was worth it to liquidate 500,000 Iraqi children to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Well, if in their mind, if that's democracy, it shows you how perverted they are. And of course, it may be true that that's what they believe. And in the case of Victoria Nuland, she's part of one of the top families of the neoconservative ideology that goes back to Leo Strauss and the people who drafted the original Notverordnung, the emergency decree that Hitler used after the Reichstag fire. So they do have a belief that might makes right. And, it's the old divine right of kings, isn't it? The idea that we were put here by God to run the place and people better listen to us or else. And I think what's changing is that in the past, there were no alternatives for most of the countries of the world. I mean, someone pointed out at our conference this last weekend that of the 54 African nations, not one is supporting US sanctions against Russia. Many of them have abstained on the vote at the United Nations. Many of them, I think 15 of them, have voted against the sanctions, but not one has stood up and supported the sanctions despite enormous pressure on them. Kamala Harris just went to Africa Blinken's been there. Sullivan's been there. We've sent military figures there. And the Africans are saying, look, you've killed our leaders. You've stolen our resources. Don't come here and lecture us about democracy. Now, that's a profound change in the most recent period. And that, I think, is what has the oligarchy behind the elected officials so freaked out that they can issue orders now, the so-called rules-based order. And countries are saying, but these are not orders that are good for our country. And if you actually have a movement based on national sovereignty sweeping the developing sector, and a country that has an economy that can help them survive the economic blackmail that can be imposed on them by London and Wall Street, then that's a changed situation. And then you get to the point where, at what point will we use military to overthrow every one of these governments? And that becomes quite a big task for the Newlands of this world.
Well, of course, it's a huge change from the 50s and under the John Foster Dulles doctrine of if you ain't with us, you're against us. And anybody that tried to be neutral, the Pugwa, not, the conference in Indonesia and all of the people that tried to be, no, we don't want to be on a side. We just want to be the neutral people. And that was absolutely verboten by Dulles and the State Department in the 50s.
And by Brzezinski and Kissinger. If you look at the situation with the Gandhi family, Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi were both killed. You look at the Bhuttos, Ali Bhutto and his daughter Benazir. They were not willing to march to the tune of the International Monetary Fund in the West, and they were killed by so-called terrorists. Aldo Moro was willing to have the historic compromise, bring the communists into the Italian government in order to stabilize the political situation. He was kidnapped, held somewhere for almost a month and a half, and then his body was thrown onto the street in Rome. We had, 6 or 8 attempts against Charles de Gaulle to assassinate him. The famous one is the Jackal story, but de Gaulle, every time he turned the corner, was concerned that there might be 5 rifles aimed at his head. So that's the reality. Now, the difference is that in the past, you had significant forces in the developing sector that were willing to set up military dictatorships and feather their own nests in order to be part of the system. There were very few people like Lumumba or Nkrumah who stood up and fought that. Now you've got a growing sense of authority in the global South with people like Lula, with Modi, the Saudi prince bin Salman. He's certainly not kissing Joe Biden's ring, and that's a huge shift. The fact that the Saudis and the Iranians buried the hatchet not in each other's heads, but in British geopolitics. This in itself, we could take an hour to discuss the incredible historic implications of this unfolding drama. What are we going to do to the Saudis? Well, we could launch a coup. We could try to overthrow them, but would it work? You don't think Mohammed bin Salman is protecting himself? So, I think this is a moment of revolutionary change. And people like Blinken, who think that everything's predestined to go their way, are having a hard time dealing with reality. I see it in Germany. Just a funny instance the other day. My wife was in a department store in downtown Potsdam, and 2 people behind her was Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, who was shopping for something for her kids for Easter. So my wife went up to her and said to her, how can you explain the International Criminal Court, your government supported the International Criminal Court indicting Putin, but doing nothing about Blair, Cheney, and Bush? And Baerbock looked at her somewhat surprised and said, I'm sorry, I can't discuss this now. I'm here to shop. And then 2 security guys stepped in between her and my wife. But that's what you have to do. You have to show these people that their lies don't work. And there were people in line who were very upset that my wife did that. because they say, oh, here's royalty. Here's the, you can't confront them. Well, you have to confront them. You're not human if you allow these kinds of charades that cost people's lives, if you allow these things to continue without questioning them.
I don't know if I've showed you my glass seagull yet, but this is my glass seagull, which sits up here to remind me of the importance of Glass-Steagall. And because I couldn't remember the name of that law for the longest time, and then I remembered we had this beautiful glass bird. So the glass seagull issue is very important when we're talking about what the other third rail you touched, which is de-dollarization. We haven't explored it much. I really had two more things on my agenda: de-dollarization, and April 19th, the announcement of RFK Jr. and what's your reaction to that? So, de-dollarization, and that concerns me a whole lot, because I don't see the American people waking up to the importance of my glass seagull. And if they don't, then the dollar is looking really shaky to me. And then, that's where everything, every American is completely dependent upon the value of the dollar sustaining it. At least, at least we could buy a tank full of gas once a week. But even if we don't drive, we have to buy stuff. This is not a self-sufficient economy anymore. So I would like to know what you think of the future of the dollar is, and how can we protect ourselves from a tragic loss through inflation.
Well, here's the problem we face. The Federal Reserve made a decision in 2008 that there were such things as banks that are too big to fail, and that these are also called sci-fis, systemically important financial institutions. So everything must be done to protect them, everything, including trillions of dollars of financial printing to provide liquidity to insolvent institutions. Now, once you go down that pathway, you can't suddenly stop and say, oh, that was a mistake. Let's let these institutions go through bankruptcy. You actually can, but the people who are doing it are not going to do it. And so a few $1 trillion from the original TARP fund turned into 27 plus trillion during the 2008 to 2010 period under initially Hank Paulson and then Obama. And then you have the problem that's starting in 2019, when it turned out that so many of the corporations were in debt, they couldn't meet their interest payments, and they had to get more cash. So the Fed came up with another $20 trillion. So, I think it was Everett Dirksen who once said, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. Well, now it's $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there. And what does that do to the dollar? Now, then let's look at the other side of this, the deindustrialization, which, in order to keep some of these corporations in business, they were allowed to outsource, to move their corporate production to poor countries for cheap labor, not the same kind of quality control. And of course, China took advantage of that. That's how China built up their economy. Other countries did the same thing, Vietnam. But in the meantime, we're having growing trade deficits. In fact, 2022 was the largest trade deficit in American history. And it was a huge deficit in finished goods, capital goods, industrial machinery, and so on, because we had a slight surplus in so-called services. But services, don't add up anything compared to the effect of if you have to buy your machinery and your finished products from overseas. So that's also affecting the dollar. And so as these other countries like China become more wealthy, their population is asking, well, why should we keep working for cheap labor, cheap wages to serve the American market? And so the Chinese correctly said, well, we'll give you wage increases. And so China has a middle class right now by international standards of over 350 million people, because they've raised the standard of living 800 million out of poverty and 350 some million into a category of the middle class where they can travel internationally, they have cash and so on. So meanwhile, what's happening with the dollar? Well, they say that 1 out of 3 households in the United States couldn't raise $600 if they had to for an emergency short of credit cards. And families are already over their heads in mortgage debt, credit card debt, insurance payments, medical costs, and so on. So the dollar has already had a severe slippage. I mean, I was just reminded of this the other day when we were looking at real estate prices in the United States. And I remembered my family's first home in Vineland, New Jersey in 1954 was $4,000, which my father was able to finance through the GI Bill. And, that little small 2-bedroom house, it's still there, still in Vineland, New Jersey. It just went on sale for $230,000. Now, think about car prices. What you pay for a car today, you could have bought a nice house in the 1970s. So this is the real inflation. This is where the dollar is going, because we're taking it out of physical good production into funny money and speculation. So it's already happened. We're already paying for it. It's like Wile E. Coyote going off the cliff, and he just hasn't realized that he's about to hit the bottom. Now, hopefully, people in the United States can look at the rest of the world and stop before they go off the cliff and say, this is not a good strategy. Let's change what we're doing. Instead of going to war with China, let's take a look at what they've learned. Let's see if we could learn something from that. So, in a very short summary, that's what I would say to the question on the dollar. It's already lost, but we can win it back because we still have a constitutional system. We were the ones who originally developed the national banking policy, the investment policy, the policies such as the investment tax credit, which isn't what Trump did. Trump basically gave a blank check to corporations to bring their money back with no obligation as to where to put it. And what did they do? They bought their own stock so they could increase their bonuses. Whereas with Kennedy, the idea of the investment tax credit was you get a tax credit if you invest it in something physical, in increased plant and equipment, research and development, new product lines. So we need to go back to that. And then, of course, Glass-Steagall, which would simply say, if you want a banking system that's worth a damn, you can't have clients' deposits or your customers have their savings accounts go into the casino economy, because there's no bottom to it. There's no guarantee that it'll be protected. So the idea of Glass-Steagall is that commercial banks are protected, maybe up to $1 million. Who knows? They'll have to figure that out. But that money then is available for banks to lend for physical projects in the area, regional development, construction bonds, and so on, or mortgages to other people, but not to the stock market and not to the derivatives markets. That's what Glass-Steagall would do. So we have the legislative means to do it. We've just got a totally corrupt Congress and a population which hasn't figured out that they're about to go off the cliff. And my job, the job of the LaRouche movement, the Schiller Institute, is to speak loudly and often enough to the American people and the people of Western Europe and point out to them they're about to head over the cliff, not like the guy on the street corner saying the end is near, but to explain it the way I just explained it. There's a remedy to this, but it means changing the policy. And that's the point we have to get across.
Sequester the good money from the bad money. Separate the risky money from the commercially sound investment money.
A wall of separation is what Roosevelt called it when it was implemented. The Glass-Steagall bill was early 1933, after Roosevelt first came in.
And I wish we could wave a magic wand and do that, Harley. But what the problem is that we're all in the casino now. And as I recall, the only way to get out of a casino is to go up to the chip to the cashier and give him your chips and say, "Here, can I have some real money now?"
Yeah.
And so what sounds like to me is what we need, a new dollar. We need a dollar that's based upon a sound commercial banking system, and it's not can't be the old instrument, because the old instrument is now nothing but a poker chip.
Well, and at this point, if the rest of the world starts not accepting dollars, and look, this isn't about to happen right away because the rest of the world is not suicidal. They know that the US still has a lot of power for the good as well as for the bad. But the Russians are very clear on this. Up until recently, the Russians kept calling the US our partners. The Chinese keep offering to bring the United States in on the Belt and Road Initiative. So the rest of the world would rather see the United States dump the speculative casino economy and return to the policies we had in the 50s and 60s, where we actually did help countries develop a little bit. You look at John Kennedy's speeches, in especially 1958, when he was in the US Senate, he was speaking about decolonization. He was talking about the enormous potential of Africa because of its raw materials, but that this was not being realized because of the Western companies that were going in and stripping the countries bare. Well, it's clearly he understood something about that. People did used to understand that. Now instead you have everyone on a get-rich-quick scheme, and the whole media culture is oriented toward entertainment and the greatest titillation you can get for your money. It's such a degenerate society we have in the West right now,
Right.
as opposed to the idea that we're going to learn something and we're going to use it to improve the future. And in the meantime, the profits that we can generate, the real wealth that's produced, will allow us to live better today and pay off our debts in the future, as opposed to the idea that we're just going to keep paying for the mortgage on a credit card at 19.9%. So, that's the solution, but it's really a tough sell for Americans who want to keep up with the Joneses, who see the neighbor come home with some new gimmick and a new car, an SUV that's 3 stories tall, and they say, we need one of those.
But all you're saying is that the Lipmans and the Bernays have been successful in controlling the minds of the American population, and I don't think it's true. I think that people, do value their sense of their own consciousness, their own sense of right and wrong, their common
own dignity, the dignity of being a productive human being.
Right.
That gives people a sense of a purpose in life. If your purpose in life is having enough money to go to the fancy strip club once a week, it's pretty hollow. But people have sold out on that dignity because they wanted some kind of way to get off the treadmill.
I want to get back to President Kennedy, though. Of course, one of the strong theories of why he had to be eliminated was that he had launched a dollar that wasn't part of the Federal Reserve System, that it was based upon the full faith and credit in the Treasury Department. And that dollar, I've actually got one of them, a silver certificate.
Yeah, I have some of those too.
Right. And so, but isn't that the way out, is to say, okay, we are now changing our national currency from that was based on the Federal Reserve System to a new one that is based upon the full faith and credit of the United States. And this is now going to be the new dollar. Call it a new greenback or a Kennedy dollar. And that then puts the pressure on the other guys to say, wait a minute, we want to negotiate. We don't want to lose all the value of these petrodollars that we've been hoarding in Saudi Arabia.
If you look at the rest of the world, that's what they're doing. What the Russians are now talking about, the BRICS Development Bank. They had the conference in Beijing. The reason Lula went to Beijing, besides to meet with Xi Jinping, was that his old protege, Dilma Rousseff, who was run out as president of Brazil by a fraudulent Department of Justice style scam, she's now the head of the BRICS Development Bank. And what is the BRICS Development Bank? Countries that want to borrow money for real projects can now line up and get it. And then you talk about the shift, the currency change, the move out of the SWIFT transaction system into one which can use regional and local currencies, the ruble for the rupiah, the yuan for payments for oil, and so on. That's what the other countries are moving towards. And they'll still accept dollars, but in fact, the de-dollarization is real. You know, Brazil in 2022 dumped $22 billion of US treasuries, sold them back to the US. In March of this year, they did that with $23 billion in 1 month, more than the whole year in 2022. Japan sold off close to $200 billion worth of US securities. China close to $200 billion worth. It's not that they're saying we're going to dump the dollar and get rid of the dollar. It's they're saying we've got to hedge our bets. And what are they doing with that? They're taking the money they're getting and they're buying gold. They're buying raw materials. They're investing in strategic mineral deposits. And making deals with potential trade partners to help them improve their ports and their transportation systems. So the rest of the world is moving in a different direction. What's unfathomable to the American people is that China and Russia are closer to the tradition of the American system than we are. And I'm not saying American system to say rah, rah, America. It's that the system that Hamilton set up that was approved by George Washington and the Founding Fathers, that was brought back by Abraham Lincoln, that McKinley tried to bring back before he was killed. And by the way, Lincoln, McKinley, and John F. Kennedy all were going in the same direction when they were assassinated, which tells you something about how dangerous it is to break with the private banks that control the Federal Reserve System. But in each of those cases, they launched programs that led to an enormous expansion of US productive capability. So this is what we've bequeathed to the world. We're not saying every country should adopt the American system as per Hamilton, Lincoln, and Kennedy, but we're saying this is a model that's different from the British system, which the Americans are now living under. And that's why our dollar is turning into funny money.
On April 19th, we will celebrate the anniversary of Paul Revere's ride, who from Boston, Massachusetts, rode through the countryside hollering, "The British are coming, the British are coming." And on this coming April the 19th, RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the son of the martyred RFK and the nephew of the martyred JFK, will announce his candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I think it's a momentous occasion. What comments do you have with regard to RFK Kennedy and his candidacy for the presidency?
Well, I saw some very interesting comments from him on the Ukraine war, on what we're talking about now, the control that's in the hands of private interests, the fact that government has been completely taken over by these private corporate cartels. I think that's a good message. I think that's something that needs to be heard. I don't know too much more about him, but listening to some of these comments from him, and there was an interview I saw, I don't know if it was Amy Goodman or who it was with, but he just made this point that it's foolish to go to war with Russia and China. Why would we do something like that? And I think what makes him a special threat is that he probably knows from his family the story of the cover-up of the assassination both of his uncle John and his father, Robert Kennedy Sr. And I think the deep state is extremely nervous about a Robert Kennedy presidential campaign. But I think it's too early for me to say more than it's an intriguing idea. I hear that Trump is somewhat friendly with him, that maybe there would be a Trump RFK Jr. ticket. Who knows?
All right, Harley Schlanger, the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche Organization, very grateful once again to have a chat with you on some of the most important issues that we face in the nation and in the world. It's an honor and a privilege. Thank you, Harley.
Well, thank you, John. I always enjoy these discussions.
All right, all the best, everyone. I will see you tomorrow night with a trio with David and Mark. So we'll see you then.